Tennis used to be unique in the sense players had to coach themselves, but it's still an expensive option that only the pros can afford, which means most of us still have the opportunity to learn the skill of self-coaching. Regardless, strategic knowledge of the player is required for adjustments shot to shot and point to point. From the coach's box, the natural tendency is to game plan from the lens of, quote, what would I do? An interesting comparison would be the NFL, where the offensive or defensive coordinators call plays the team must execute. While the objective of the play call may be spot on, this structure of, quote, outsourcing strategy fails to consider how the players are feeling at that moment. The poke, brawl, dive framework is the ultimate system, as it establishes the focus of, quote, what needs to be accomplished, while giving the player autonomy on how to reach that objective most effectively within their comfort zone and capability. To preface before we begin, assume fixing mechanics is not feasible. If you walk into battle with a blunt stick, you cannot ask the enemy to kindly wait while you fetch and sharpen your broadsword. Strategy pertains to fighting with what you have and is the most productive advice mid-match, assuming the player has their head on straight. Also, there should be minimal to no experimentation or deep contemplation if a proper system was installed prior to making decisions, as players need both the alacrity and confidence to execute in the heat of the battle. So how to give precise instruction where the player still has full discretion to calibrate based on their current physical and emotional state? That's what we'll discuss today. Starting a match. Since 1, each day presents new conditions, and 2, players are not robots, there's an assessment process that takes place during the first few games. Getting your, quote, teeth into the match is synonymous for setting yourself up to play your best tennis as a whole. Let's discuss 3 early match scenarios where additional poke, brawl, or dive may come into play off the first toss. If you're out of sync. It's sometimes difficult to get a proper warm-up, and often getting used to a new set of conditions throws a player out of kilter, making them feel tight and tentative. Brawling, being off rhythm, will get you blown off the baseline, being unable to strike the ball clean and accurate to contest space. Diving is also a fool's errand, as the body is not ready for explosive bursts. That leaves us only with poke, to give up a little space to find your balance, swing slower to deflect pace better, slice to get your legs engaged, and not rushing into your offense. Once you've established your footing, feel physically ready to fight, and settle into a comfortable rhythm. The brawl option is way more viable if you choose to switch later. If you're excited or nervous, the fight or flight response is part of stepping into new situations where physiologically blood rushes from the smaller parts of the body to the bigger regions. Players lose some of their fine motor skills in the hands to be precise and accurate, but experience additional spring and vitality in the body to move and endure. Locking an opponent into an early grind may not only help expel that excess energy and relax you, but apply some early body blows to lower the opponent's level as the match progresses. Brawling well early on can shift the match, as players must now account for a limited gas tank moving forward, and if you have lots of gas to start, might as well use it. If you're calm and locked in. Good general advice for players is to slowly work their way into the match by poking or brawling. But given conditions are optimal and the opponent is still finding their way, it makes sense to mix in more dive. While it's nice getting out of the gates fast, a panicking opponent will calm down eventually, so you must recalibrate the amount of dive once that happens. Additionally, diving early on dials in the range of your finishing shots for later in the match. It's increasingly difficult to put a float volley away on set point if you haven't hit a single volley all match long. Even unsuccessful dives become part of an early investment that will yield higher returns moving forward, especially if finishing points is required. A few games in, assume both players have shaken off the jitters and calibrated their shots. Despite vigilantly scouting, do not assume your opponent will respond to your game under a given set of conditions in the same exact way. Always start the match with your primary game by default, but adjust in real time based on what's happening. The key question is always, quote, what is my opponent trying to accomplish? Based on the answer is where your heuristic decision-making tree starts. Based on the primary matchups, the losing player tends to adjust first to counter or mirror the opponent, which should shift the strategic advantage their way. If the secondary style used to counter is still losing, then the disparity in skill may be too large to overcome. Otherwise, the countered player will switch to counter the counter. Likely, this ends up as a mix of primary and secondary styles finding a satisfactory equilibrium where neither player has a major disadvantage or advantage. Few players have the option to mix in their weakest style, so tend to mix back more of their primary style once the secondary style to neutralize a counter is established. If you are winning the primary style matchup, all you should be watching for is their counter so you can counter their counter. That is essentially the only way the better player loses, though most players are extremely slow to switch. Switching quickly and precisely allows you to snuff the flame before it gets out of hand, similar to a good basketball coach who immediately substitutes his players to match the opposing team. Lastly, if your game is extremely limited to one style, you may decide to go down with the ship if you've concluded that your primary with a headwind outweighs your secondary with a tailwind. But with every decision to switch or stay, the player must do a mental calculation based on their skill level with each style, their opponents, and the conditions. In summary, if you play at a strategic deficit for a prolonged period of time, you're going to be giving up a lot of points purely due to poor strategy. While the theory may seem like a perpetual game of rock, paper, scissors with poke, brawl, and dive, most matches have a few distinct switches before ending. Players typically run out of options to swap, or the match finds an equilibrium both players find satisfactory. At the highest professional level, the dynamic still exists, but there's a far more blending of styles right off the bat to keep the opponent in check. Eventually, you'll settle on a mix of primary and secondary that either hard counters your opponent or neutralizes their hard counter. But this time, it won't be lucky, and you'll know exactly why. The goal is to achieve strategic consistency, where it seems as if you've, quote, seen everything, without actually having done so. Just like any other facet of tennis, whether it's strokes or stamina, this is a developed skill that should improve linearly straight up and to the right if you know what you're doing.